There's a lot to get through on this lesson. So let's look at how this relationship has changed over time. You have some resources in Moodle about dual federalism to cooperative federalism. I'm going to focus on the next step. After we moved from a situation where the state's powers were distinctly separate into one where they were more cooperative, where has this relationship gone now? So you'll notice my subtitle here is How Has Money Changed This Relationship? Fiscal federalism is defined as the pattern of spending, taxing, and providing grants in the federal system. Basically, today, this is the cornerstone of this relationship. We all pay taxes to the federal government, and then the federal government in turn sends that money back to the states in a variety of ways. So how do they distribute the federal pie, so to speak? There are several types of grants, or what are called grants in aid. The first type is called a categorical grant. Categorical grants are very specific and very carefully controlled. Lots and lots of strings attached. For a long time, this was pretty much the only method of grants that the federal government gave. I'm going to give you an example that I'm very familiar with, and so are you, which is the school lunch. The federal government got into the business of subsidizing the school lunch program, primarily to help aid low-income children who weren't getting adequate food at home. Let's set up a school lunch program that we partially subsidize to make sure that these children have at least a meal or two a day. And for some, it is just that meal or two a day. So how does the system work? With a categorical grant, the strings are very, very tightly woven. So in order for a school lunchroom to get the grant money, you have to eat from 3 food groups. You notice in the lunchroom it's pick three. And this is defined by the federal government. In the 80s, under the Reagan administration, ketchup was defined as a vegetable. So this can change from time to time. Right? At this point, it's pick 3. And pick 3 is a healthy meal. And if you pick 3, the lunchroom gets the grant, and you get the cheaper price for your lunch. If you don't pick from 3 food groups, you pay, I think our lunchroom puts it as a la carte. You pay the unsubsidized price, which means you might get the pizza and you don't get anything else, and you pay more than the kid with a whole tray full of food. The reason is because that's the nature of this grant. If you don't meet the parameters, they don't get the money. In the 80s, they began to move away from categorical grants to what are called block grants. Block grants still have strings. I mean, there's no such thing as a free lunch, no pun intended, but there's always going to be strings attached to sending money. But with a block grant, it's broader. I'm going to give you another education example because those are the ones I'm most familiar with. With a block grant, let's talk about technology, for instance. If it were given as a categorical, they might say, well, you have to buy laptops or you have to buy this or that. With a block grant, they just give a broad category and say you must spend money in this area and meet these overall goals and parameters. So, we have an iPad one-to-one initiative. We don't need software. We don't need, other infrastructure things sometimes. Or we don't need equipment. We might need infrastructure. So we need to update our wireless system. We need maybe a way to purchase apps for students or whatever. We could fit that into a block grant, and the school system down the road that has a different way of handling this could spend their money differently. Okay? Another type of grant are project grants. Project grants are given to predominantly for like medical research, educational programs, social programs that, experiments in the state. Maybe they want to fund a new program that might help the homeless or drug-addicted individuals, or money for medical research. A lot of money comes to Birmingham through UAB and its research facilities for medical testing. That the government allots X number of money. They give it to the National Institutes of Health, who call for grant proposals to be written. And if your research lab writes a winning proposal, we want to research cure for this, you get the grant money. Obviously, you have to fill out lots of paperwork and where did the money go, but you get that money from the government to conduct your research. Formula grants are relatively new over the course of history. And that sets up a lot of highway construction is on formula grants. So the federal government kicks in X amount, the state kicks in X amount, local kicks in X amount. And it's based on a formula and percentages. Okay? Now, why is this money given to state and local governments from the federal government? Is it because they're just kind? Well, of course not. The only reason you ever give money in this kind of relationship is to gain influence and power. So when the national government gives money to the states, they gain influence and power over the states. Take a look at this map on the next slide. This should show you, I think this map is interesting. If I were you, I'd pause and just kind of look at the map. As you look at those pictures, the states in brown, they are completely hooked. I mean, 44 to almost 50% of their state budget is made up of federal funding. So what happens if the federal government cuts back funding? I liken this relationship to almost like a drug pusher and the addicts. They get you hooked on the money, and then you do whatever they want. And unfortunately, that's sort of the downside or the negative side to this relationship nowadays, is that the national government gets the states kind of dependent on the funding. And then, as a result, the states have to do the things the national government wants to do, and the citizens of the states become dependent on that money, or on those services that are offered with that money, and the states have a hard time pulling out, just like that drug addict can't seem to give up the habit. So, if you look at Alabama there, for instance, we're in the middle of the pack, but we get an awful lot of our state budget comes from federal funding. During the state bailouts in, I guess it was 2009, one of the things that the federal government wanted to do was to expand unemployment coverage to individuals, expand the amount of time people could get unemployment, expand the pool of people who are eligible for unemployment for a longer period of time, etc. Alabama was one of the few states that said no. And citizens in the state said, well, wait a minute, don't you want us to have these unemployment benefits? And I don't think the state necessarily explained themselves very well, but the reason that they said no was because they would have had to change state law to make different people eligible and then to continue it. And they said, what happens when the federal money goes away, which it will in a couple of years? Then we have people that are dependent on those services and those programs, and we have no money coming in to pay for it. So while states can say no, that's sort of a rare example. So, savor it. It doesn't happen very often. So this scramble for the federal dollars follows a little bit of a principle of what's called universalism. There's a little something for everybody. So every state gets a little bit of something, okay? But some states get more than others. And if you back up to that map, you can see a little bit more of that. I took out another map that showed that, but I'll pop it up on our Moodle site. A mandate, let me define a mandate. Mandates direct state and local government to comply with federal rules, generally under a threat or as a promise for receipt of this federal grant. So like in the example I just gave you with Alabama, and they could have maybe mandated that we had to do that in order to get the money. And actually they do mandate. If we wanted the money, we'd have to do what they asked us to do. Well, sometimes they move you far enough down the road. You're accepting funding in a variety of ways, and education, again, is a great place and way to describe this. And they get you dependent on it, and then they make another mandate. And maybe you think, that one goes just a little too far. I don't like that one. But at this point, you put all of your funding in jeopardy if you say no. So that kind of falls us under the category of unfunded mandates. States hate them. School systems hate them. But, once you've accepted some money, how do you do without the money? So, for example, special education law, which was written back in the 70s, mandated special education services for students who needed it, whether that was because of a learning disability or a handicap. But a little-known portion of that law also mandates special education services for gifted students as well as for those on the lower end of the spectrum. However, federal funding only gives money to states for the students that have learning disabilities or handicaps. It gives the schools no money for gifted education. So you have a wide variety of the kinds of services that are given for gifted education because schools don't get money for it, and so they comply with the law, but they comply in a variety of ways because, they don't have the funds, and so they figure out the best way to do it. In our system, at high school level, we offer AP, we have IB, and we have those opportunities for you to push yourself if you're willing to do so. Now, the states often call this coercive federalism, and I'm going to give you a specific example on the next slide. Now, let me give you a couple of examples that deal with our highways. In the 1970s, we had an energy crisis, and so the federal government decided to regulate speed limits, and they set a national maximum speed limit of 55 miles an hour. Some states sort of argued about it. This is a state power, and they said, well, these are interstate highways. And so they put funding at risk in that and threatened to withhold funding, which made states comply. Another example, which you may not be aware of, dealt with alcohol. In 1984, Congress passed the Uniform Drinking Age Act, and it mandated that states had to raise the drinking age to a minimum of 21 years old. In most states, the drinking age was 18 or 19, depending upon the state, because that was something controlled by the states. And South Dakota sued. South Dakota said, whoa, wait a minute, the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition, said that states would regulate whether they were wet or dry, whether, what was the age to drink, did we allow it everywhere, etc. So this isn't your power, Congress. And secondly, they said, this is coercive, because, see, if states didn't comply, the federal government said, well, we're going to withhold 5% of your highway dollars. So South Dakota took it to the Supreme Court, and in the Supreme Court ruled that it was not unduly coercive. So they admitted to the coercive nature, but they said this is not unduly coercive. It's just 5%. And most states ponied up, and they complied pretty fast. Louisiana didn't, and their roads were awful forever, but they finally have complied, although they don't enforce. Anybody who's been to New Orleans knows that. But this is a good example of this sort of coercive federalism. So real quick, what are some advantages and disadvantages? Well, federalism increases your access to government. Local problems can be solved locally with local solutions. And it's harder for political parties or interest groups to dominate everything because they've got to capture each level of government. Disadvantages, well, states have different levels of service. Education's better in some places than others. Special services, say, for the mentally handicapped or the mentally insane, differs from place to place. Sometimes local interests counteract national interests. And some people complain that just having so many levels of government just means we're spending way too much money on government. So, quick summary. American federalism is a governmental system in which power is shared between a central government and the 50 states. We have moved from dual to cooperative, fiscal to new, and there are both advantages and disadvantages to our democracy in having a federal system. So, here are your questions. What 20th century events have contributed to the shift from dual federalism to cooperative federalism? And in the near future, do you think the trend of cooperative federalism with the federal government taking a dominant role over the states will continue? Or, and if so, do you think it will continue into the distant future? Or do you think that the role of the national government should be scaled back and maybe the states should take more control? Be prepared to explain your answers in your face-to-face interview. Thanks.